It's vital to understand your situation before you begin. The first thing to do is get a complete copy of your lease. Leases usually have multiple parts, and you need to make sure you have all of them. The main body of the lease is the most important. However, there are often other components that may or may not be attached, for example, an addendum or an amendment, both of which can change the terms of the lease entirely. There will also be exhibits which often explain the space layout, the parking, any work done by the landlord or the tenant, and a host of other important items. Also, the lease commencement document. It's common that the main body of the lease won't state the exact commencement date. The reason is that it's usually tied to the completion of your build-out, so that date is unknown when the lease is signed. For that reason, there is often a separate document used to memorialize the date of the official lease commencement, and that's done when the built-out is near completion. There are many important lease provisions that are tied to that date, for example, the right to terminate early, the right to extend, and of course your lease expiration date. After you've gathered all the relevant documents, look through them and make sure the version you have is the one that's been signed by all parties. During a lease negotiation, there are a lot of documents being emailed throughout the process. Most of them are not the final version. Sometimes one of these is accidentally saved, and that's what you might receive when you ask for a copy of your lease. The best way to ensure that you have the correct version of the lease is to check that your copy has been signed by all parties. If you can't locate that version, then I recommend asking your legal counsel, because they often save their own copy of the signed lease. That could be either with your in-house counsel or a law firm that you outsource to. If you still can't find it, then you can also try asking your landlord. Most will be happy to accommodate you. I have seen some obvious mistakes made simply because someone did not have all the current documents. Avoid this mistake by making sure you have everything. After you've received a complete copy of your lease with all related documents that have been signed by all parties, you can then start your review. Office leases can be quite long, and so to save some time, I'm going to list what I think are the most important elements to review. I would also recommend discussing this with your broker and your legal counsel. Given that you're trying to get rid of excess space, the first thing to check for is a termination option. You might have the right to terminate the lease early, which could potentially solve the problem quickly and easily. If there is such an option, then there's probably a fee and a specified time period when you can exercise it. Most fees are either unamortized leasing costs or a certain number of months' rent, or some combination of the two. Run a calculation of the fee, because you'll need that later when you compare it to a sublease scenario. Your right to sublease your space depends on what was negotiated when your lease was signed. Almost all leases will give you the right to sublease. However, there can be important restrictions. For example, if the rental rate the subtenant pays you is higher than what you're paying the landlord, who gets the profit? In many cases, it's split 50-50 net of any costs you incur to complete the sublease. However, I've seen leases in which the landlord gets 100% of the profit and others that give the tenant 100% of the profit. You might think that hanging that sign for sublease is no big deal, but it's not uncommon for a landlord to prohibit this. Some landlords think it looks bad to have those signs on the building. Whether there's any merit to that concern is debatable. The only thing that matters to you is if your lease will allow it. If it does, then in most cases you'll want to hang a sign. It's cheap advertising and it will improve your chances of finding a subtenant. If the lease prohibits a sign, then I would recommend requesting permission from the landlord. Even though it's technically not allowed, it's possible an exception will be made if your landlord is feeling charitable. Another important question is if you have the right to sublease your space at any lease rate you choose. Depending on what was negotiated, you might be prohibited from subleasing your space for less than what you're currently paying. Landlords like this provision because it keeps lease rates for their building from being depressed by a tenant who offers their space at a steep discount. If discounting is prohibited, it can render your space virtually impossible to sublease. The reason is that most spaces will sublease at a lower rate compared to a direct lease with the landlord. Therefore, it would be very difficult to find someone willing to sublease your space at the same rate you're paying the landlord. The exception to this rule is if lease rates have moved up significantly since you signed your lease. That would mean that you're paying a below market rent, which might make it possible to find a subtenant who is willing to pay you the same or more than your current rent. If you are allowed to sublease at any rate, there can still be restrictions on what rate you're allowed to advertise. For example, you might be prohibited from offering your space at a lower rate than what the landlord is asking for direct space. Some landlords think that advertising low rates is the equivalent of bad PR for their building. If this is the case, then you might be better off not advertising a sublease rate. Just leave it off the marketing material and let prospective subtenants make their best offer. Do you have options to renew your lease? If so, depending on how your lease is written, you might be able to offer your subtenant a longer term. Does the landlord have any recapture rights? This would allow the landlord to terminate your lease and take the space back. This isn't necessarily a bad thing since your goal is to dispose of the space. However, you want to be aware of it, particularly if you're in a hot market and you think there might be some profit to be made on a sublease. Recapture rights are often tied to the amount of space you're trying to sublease. For example, the lease might stipulate that if you sublease more than 50% of your space, the landlord then has the right to terminate your lease and recapture the space. Finally, most leases will require landlord approval for completing a sublease. The way it's usually phrased in the lease is that the landlord approval is required for any sublease or assignment, but such approval cannot be reasonably withheld. Sometimes there are specific reasons the landlord can disapprove. For example, if the prospective subtenant doesn't meet a certain financial threshold. Sometimes other tenants in the building have no-compete clauses that restrict what tenants the landlord will allow in the building. So your lease might prevent you from subleasing to a company that is a competitor to another tenant in the building. The landlord can disapprove a sublease for any reason it could be problematic. If that's the case, then I would recommend having a discussion with your landlord and asking what reasons they might disapprove a sublease. This will help you avoid wasting a lot of time and energy completing a negotiation only to have it denied by your landlord. When you signed your lease, there's a good chance you received an allowance from your landlord to complete your build-out. This is called a tenant improvement allowance, and it's normally abbreviated to the phrase TI allowance. It typically has a specified dollar amount you can spend and a certain period when you can spend it. It's not common, but I have seen cases in which a tenant has not used all of this allowance, and the time period has not expired. That means the tenant can force the landlord to spend additional money building out the space, which in turn means it can be used as leverage to complete a lease termination. In short, the message to the landlord is, work with us on a lease termination and we won't make you spend this money. And if there's a lease termination option with a fee, it could be used as a credit against that fee. Lastly, check your holdover rate. This is your rental rate if you stay in the space beyond the term of your lease, and it's typically a significant increase over what you're currently paying. It's important to know your financial exposure so that you can determine the urgency of this project.